I'm Ben Hobson, co-CEO of Dezeen, the online architecture and design magazine. I'm very happy to be here at 30 Fenchurch Street tonight to host this talk together with Brookfield Properties. Brookfield are one of our sponsors for Dezeen Awards this year, the winners of which will be announced at the Dezeen Awards party later this month. Brookfield Properties are sponsoring our sustainability categories, and that is the topic of conversation today. How sustainable design can help create happier workforces. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Pragya Adukia, who is Design Director at Brookfield Properties, Dan Sibert, who is a Senior Partner at Foster & Partners, and Esme Marr, who's Strategy Director at BVN Architecture. If you would like to introduce yourselves in order and just say a little bit about what you do in your roles. Yeah.
Good evening, Ben. Hi, everyone. I'm Pragya Adukia. I'm the Design Director with Brookfield Properties. I'm passionate about designing spaces from the inside out and balancing good design with commerciality. So that's what brings us here today. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you. And Dan?
Hi, I'm Dan Sibert. I'm an architect and senior partner at Foster & Partners. We produce this report jointly between us and Brookfield called Designing the Workplace. I have a particular fascination with places where we work and how they influence the cities around them.
And Esme, just finally, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do.
Thanks, Ben. I'm Esme. I work for BVN. I'm a strategist. My background is in occupier insights, so I'm really interested in the user experience, the people experience in space, and I'm coming at that from kind of a strategy lens. It's awesome to be part of this panel, one that's very data-led, but also one that's very design-led, and I'm also very pleased to be working a little bit closer now to where the magic happens in architecture and design.
Lovely, thank you. So what's going to happen is each of our panelists are going to spend 3 to 5 minutes just introducing themselves and their work in relation to the theme, and then we'll have a wider conversation. So over to you. Tell us about what you're doing in terms of sustainable workplace design.
So Brookfield Properties has nearly 20,000 people just now working across our different buildings in London alone. And we want to believe that we're a very involved landlord. We want to make sure that we're hearing what people say, which is why we co-commissioned this report with Foster & Partners, to listen to really what the younger generation at work was saying, to give them a voice around their own sustainability ideas and goals.
And you've got some images up on the screen there. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of those properties?
Yes, so Principal Place is Amazon's headquarter building in London. It's a project we worked on with Foster & Partners with Dan's team. It's been very successful. It's also a unique scheme in that I think it was quite future forward in its thinking. Dan, correct me, And
I think, the idea of being almost a 21st century warehouse, something that could change over time. And one of the things I love about it most is Amazon have really mucked around with the building. They've really changed it since it's been built, and it has that flexibility to actually be changed like that. And it has a community inside it, which we think is amazing. For me as an architect, the idea of building with life, that's a real thing.
Yes, and it's recognizing, I guess, in that space that it's got the flexibility to adapt and evolve with the needs of its occupiers. That is also sustainable design. It's about making sure it's an effective space, it's efficient, it's doing what its users need it to be. The other things, Dan, we looked at was we've created this amazing plaza outside. It's been a very successful project for us in terms of the activation. It's got art, it's got green, it's got events. It's a space where people come out for a short break to meet people. It's done multiple things for us. So in terms of how we're trying to achieve sustainability, that sort of, I think it's not just about materiality in the end, it's also about the way the space is used.
And how do you approach that as a developer or as architects in terms of creating a space where I guess you don't fully have control, where you know that the tenant is going to do things? How do you work to allow that to happen?
So most of our new developments, they're 5, 10, 15 years in the planning. So making sure that all of our spaces are flexible for their evolving needs becomes important.
And then as the architect, how do you work with that? How do you design flexibility in future-proofing into a project?
Yeah, I think, again, I talked a little bit about that sort of idea of there's a reason we see so many buildings that have been successfully repurposed, which are warehouses ultimately. When we come to the public space, I think let's just talk about it from a big scale. It didn't exist. It was a railway cutting. We effectively built a bridge and created, with Brookfield, a public space as a bridge. I think the bit that I love most, in a way, and a movement in the last few years has been the idea that developers, and I think you're a great example of this, there's no point anymore where people just say, okay, go and get on with it. You actually have to curate those spaces. You have to think about how you're going to put pieces that will go on, that will engage the community within those spaces as it goes over time. So it's, in a way, it's designing, I think, a framework for life to happen within the spaces that they can go. But you've also got to design that framework with the people at Brookfield in this case, or within the community who will come and curate that space going forwards. It's not good enough just to do the physicality piece. Yeah, this is an interesting one. This is ICD Brookfield, which is in Dubai. And for me, the key space here, which is really interesting and very unlike Dubai, for me, is a space where it's somewhere between a lobby and a public space. In those swing seasons, it just happens to be the reverse of here. It's not the summer, but it's the other parts of the year. You can open it up and it becomes open to the public realm and it becomes a real place. And this is a really interesting one. This is DGI in Shenzhen, probably the best known drone manufacturer in the world. And it's a building totally resolved around their workplace. So those little objects that you see are different workspaces in competition with each other. Every time there's a break in the space, you get the idea of being able to have a garden space. But again, what we love about working with our clients really is you really want somebody who says, I'm going to work in a completely different way. Can you build a building for me? And this is that building, ultimately. And then we go to a building I designed in Denmark, and this is Ferring Pharmaceuticals. And it's a great site because it's literally sitting out there onto the sound between Denmark and Sweden. The centre of this building is all about people. All the office space looks out to sea. And actually the centre is just about interaction, the entire centre of the building given to interaction. So again, one of the thematics of the report is really this other idea that interaction is key. And that's why we come into the office. This is Comcast. So again, actually, interesting enough, the idea of public art, and something that I think is very close to Brookfield's heart about how you incorporate art into a building. Comcast here are actually using that space as a way of projecting themselves. They're a media empire, so they project their media empire into the public realm. And then we maybe finish on Bloomberg. I think Bloomberg is best understood as a piece of theatre. You have to get your mind around the idea that Bloomberg is ultimately selling information. That is what this building is about. All the interactivity stuff we may talk about today in this building is turned up to the max because that is the entire purpose. As you walk in, you feel the buzz.
Let's get back to the workplace. Maybe, Dan, now you could talk a little bit about the report that you worked with Brookfield Properties on. We've got a video playing, and I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, this was at the Barbican, and it's talking about the idea that a majority of people really see value in coming back to the office, but particularly the idea that sustainability is absolutely key to how people feel about where they work. The bit that was then very interesting in there as well for me was this idea that is also about community and agency. And what I mean by that is this idea that it's no good just telling people. They have to be involved in the active sense of sustainability within their workplaces rather than be passive consumers of that. And I think that the other piece about it that I found fascinating myself was the idea that you could take that and you could then apply that not only within an office space between different tenants, let's say in a building like this, that you might join together, but then do you go out into the wider community and do you talk to the city around you? And somehow the ideas of sustainability is really a community-based thing. The great unknown of this is actually the fit-out carbon is massive, much, much bigger than you would imagine. So can you produce things that are not only incredibly low carbon in terms of your solutions, but can you make them inherently flexible? That means that they can be changed, they can be taken somewhere else, and can you tell people about it? So can you have on them a code that you can scan with your phone that tells you how much carbon's there? The furniture, in a way, is the same as the building. The metadata is important, and you can allow it to do that.
Great. Thank you very much. Dan, Esme, over to you. Introduce some of your work.
I promise I'll be quick. Our London studio has a core focus on the relationship between work and place. We deliberately say that and deliberately don't actually say workplace. We're across all typologies. We're almost 100 years old. There's 350 of us, a slightly smaller team here in London. But the point being that we learn from all of these different types of projects, whether it's education, it's healthcare, it is workplace, it's that cross kind of collaboration of knowledge. BVN Regenerative, so this is a practice group that we have internally who are first and foremost, they exist to upskill everybody across the practice. Very quickly on projects, but I'll probably skip through these and bring them into some of the discussion. This is Atlassian Central. You might have seen some images of this. This has literally just started construction. It's a collaboration between BVN and Shop Architects from New York. It's a hybrid timber structure, which will be one of the highest or tallest hybrid timber structures in the world. And the thing that kind of connects me to all of this, I guess, is really I'm interested in that guy there and his experience of the space. This is our Brisbane studio. So this was a project that we did for Dexus, a developer in Australia. That was a kind of ultimate endorsement. We loved the building that we created and we moved our studio to in there. We're actually undertaking a post-occupancy evaluation for the first time 18 months after move-in that I'm leading on at the moment to understand how the space is being used. But the main thing being it's completely naturally ventilated. It has operable windows. It has a winter garden where you can sit and work kind of close to the facade and you have that kind of naturally ventilated space. Queen and Collins, this is a project that came out of a really long-standing 25-year relationship we had with GPT, another Australian developer. This is, I guess, kind of equivalent a little bit to Principal Place in as much as it's a precinct. It's ultimately 3 different towers. And there's lots of different stories I could tell about this, but ultimately it kind of pushed the boundaries of how we collaborate with clients as architects. We helped them rethink leasing models during the pandemic and how they would kind of approach that with these different spaces, but also help them create a digital asset library. So all of the joinery, all of the furniture that's in these spaces, in this particular precinct, can be used again if it's not being used here or if the space changes across any of their sites. I think that's it.
Great.
That's a little bit about us.
Thank you, Esme. Thank you. So thinking again about the idea of sustainable design and in the workplace and the positive impact that it can have on employees, on staff, and to return to the report again, because Dan, I think you asked people to rank their workplace effectively about how environmentally friendly they thought it was and then track that against their general happiness, productivity and things like that. What do you think from the kind of people point of view, to go back to your point as that person in the picture, what do they understand by sustainable design?
Yeah, I mean, I think let's never underestimate the users of our building or our buildings. It's very likely that they do know exactly what, particularly if they've decided to become involved, let's say those with the willingness to come involved and get into that sustainability conversation in relationship to a building. That then is, they may well know more than us ultimately about exactly all that stuff. So I think,
and if they don't know, they probably want to know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think we need to share data with them that is the real data and that actually that they can influence in a way. I think that there's another part to it, as I said, which I think you raised about flexibility and about how it changes over time. The idea of designing buildings as a one-off that you then leave and, a sort of monuments, I think is a problem. And so I think maybe that's also a very interesting part of what we were studying.
Yeah, and Dan makes a very good point. I think we've always believed in transparency. So as Dan says, I think we have fairly intelligent tenants out there. People are more vocal about their beliefs and what they'd like to see. It's a good idea to involve these people in bigger conversations and then take on board what they want to see. I think our approach has always been, this is what can be realistically achieved. It's not just a fancy hashtag or a strap line. Let's look at the data points, as Dan says. That's very strong evidence. And then talk about what can be achieved, how we can future-proof it.
And I think just sharing that information with the tenants of the building, every single individual user of the space is probably going to want to know the impact of some of their actions, or whether they take the stairs or if they turn that light off or use this instead of that. Sometimes it's hard to think in your day-to-day life about the cause and effect of all of your individual actions, and I think playing that back to the user through the space can be a really powerful thing as well, because at the end of the day we can't plead ignorance. None of us can plead ignorance anymore. It's individually down to all of us, and we have a story to tell and we should be telling it, I think.
And do you think that desire to have transparency is something that's becoming more apparent in younger generations? I think in the report you looked at under 30s and this was coming up more and more, that actually people were saying they would consider where they would work based on the sustainability of the workplace, based on whether they've got a net zero strategy, things like that. Do you think that's becoming more and more kind of prevalent?
Well, I think the report's saying pretty much just that, isn't it? And I think the only people I know who've really pushed this for a long time is Gartner. And they've kind of said, okay, well, employees do really value, and I think at the time it was CSR, then it moved to ESG in terms of organisational goals, and that is why people will tend to work for an organisation, decide not to work for an organisation. That's kind of been not peddled, but pushed out for a long time. I think we've largely ignored it, or well, end user organisations have largely ignored it. But yeah, I think that's absolutely a thing.
And if we're going to think about the future, we have to think about Gen Z and going forwards from Gen Z and thinking about that idea of what does it mean to be a digital native within the spaces that we create. Inherently it must mean that an expectation that the ability to interact with your environment and to understand what you're in is inherently far more present. It must mean that, in my mind. And therefore, that sort of idea of the building being active, the expectation of experience, the curated spaces, the idea that it's not something that just finishes at 6 o'clock, that it keeps going, it keeps changing. That expectation of things actually being done in a really nice way for you, I think is a key thing.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about the impact of hybrid working on sustainability and what that means. How are people using spaces today? Sometimes you're at home, sometimes you're in the office, sometimes just 3 days in the office. So the impact on sustainability, how we use space and make sure they remain effective for everyone and efficient. It has a big story lying to that.
In terms of sustainable design, are there some things which you think have a particular impact that all buildings should have, that we should always be looking for, or is it more of a kind of contextual thing in a case-by-case basis? Like, what are the big wins? If I'm an employer and I want my workplace to be happy and I want to do something that's going to have the biggest impact on the planet, but also for the people that work for me, what kind of things should I be looking at? Esme, you go first.
Something that every single employee may not recognise. Get your baseline right. Get your air quality right. If you want people to be well and to experience the space well and have an increased sense of well-being and less sick days, less infection, get your ventilation right. So I think there are some baseline things that we need to fundamentally just get right in buildings, new and existing, like first and foremost. And I think the other thing is give them a platform. Create a platform whereby you can understand what it is that they're interested in, what their desires are, what they care about, and then kind of act accordingly. Sounds quite simple, but a lot of people still fail to do it, I think.
I'm going to sort of give two examples. I think the first is DGI, and just look at DGI and think of that as a cultural building. Think about it as the expression exactly in the architecture of what that company wanted to express for its employees and what those employees wanted from the building. So that idea of being true to yourself, I think, is incredibly important. I think it has to feel authentic. It has to feel that it comes from the organisation who's created it. I'd say that. I think the other thing to me that's absolutely key is to recognise that we need to provide differential spaces for people. We can't just rely on this idea that office space is vanilla stuff that's going to be one thing. Why do we come into the office? We're coming into the office because we want to interact with others, and through that we'll not only get the education opportunities that we all took for granted, a lot of us, of how experience gets handed down, how you learn from others, but also through that interaction we get creativity. And I've got a great example for that, which is we have a cancer research centre at Stanford, and the lady who leads that said that the most innovative space in that building that has produced 3 Nobel Prizes is the cafeteria. Which to me tells you exactly what you need to know about that idea that interaction is absolutely critical.
I think to Dan's point again, interaction being critical, and a great example for us has been this building, 30 Fenchurch. We're rolling out a full electrification of the building's operational energy, and that wouldn't have been possible without interacting collaboratively with all of our key tenants. So they're going to stay in the building while we make the change. It's adapting the building to what the future needs are for this building. It's aligning our goals, our tenants' goals all together. So having, I think, that eye on the art of the possible, what's out there, having a clean conversation around this is what we can do is quite important.
So that's an example, I guess, of a developer having that kind of a much closer relationship with their tenants, and one that continues on in terms of a building, not just as something that's built and then exists, but the kind of operation of that and improving that building over time.
It's evolution. Yeah.
One kind of buzzword that's used a lot is kind of the idea of biophilic design, and in all the projects you touched on, I guess there are kind of elements of that. I guess, what do you understand by the term biophilic? Esme, I'll go to you first. What does that mean, and how does it translate in real world examples and in buildings?
I'll tell you what it's not first, and it's not putting plants into a space. I think biophilic design is a term that's been used for such a long time and in lots of different types of ways, when actually it means all of your senses, your experience of the space and your connection to nature. And really, biophilic design, we haven't moved on from it, but I feel like it's a stepping stone or a starting point to taking a really ecological worldview of things. Humans are connected to nature. And I think one of the most important things when you think about well-being is that, and you think about sustainability and where we need to get to, if I'm not connected to something, how am I going to care about it? And if I'm in these concrete jungle cities that do not have any connection to nature, and I don't experience that on a daily basis, it doesn't live in my psyche. So how am I kind of expected to care about it and create real change? Not sure whether that answered your question.
No, that's
Added
good.
to it.
I'm going to move on to Dan. He's got the tougher task of giving some examples of what it is.
So I'm going to answer in two ways. One, maybe how I would have answered it 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, I would have said to you, isn't it really exciting that if you get, again, the vision of plants, but changes in temperature over the day, if we relate to circadian rhythms, etc., we can make people potentially be more efficient at work. That's what I might have answered 5 years ago. Weirdly now, I'm much less interested in the idea of the efficiency of people at work. I'm interested in their happiness. And can we actually convert that whole idea into something that they feel that the holistic sense of how we design for them as human beings creates a place where there's a sort of virtuous circle between that sustainability ideas that we've been talking about and their happiness to be at work. One of the great issues I think we all know from lockdown and from what happened was a real problem with a lot of people's well-being when they were isolated, and ultimately I think we properly see that the world of work may be the answer to a lot of that, but we need to design it in the right way that supports them. And if I could say, look, we can design a building that makes you happier, that would be a great place.
And I think we've seen it across the portfolio as well. So increasingly, tenants and their organizations are becoming quite articulate around wanting higher quality spaces. They're shrinking to take smaller spaces, but if they're well-defined, well-designed, if they feel that this is what is going to make our employees happy, they will take it up. It's a very strong ask. I mean, we all know every project that's going up in the City of London right now has external open terraces. There's an urban greening factor. There's a desire across the board, not just the city, to make sure we've got spaces to live and breathe in.
And do you find that your clients or tenants are kind of willing and ready to go on this journey? I mean, the temptation might be just to, let's put a pot plant in the corner and hey, there we go, we've got a green building. To do things which are truly sustainable, truly biophilic, it doesn't necessarily come cheap. The economy is not in the best shape at the moment. Like, do you find that's a challenge? Are you constantly having to kind of to push this, or are you finding that your clients or your tenants are welcoming this?
Again, I think some organizations are more further along on the journey than, say, smaller ones are, which for commercial reasons or educational reasons aren't quite there. But most organizations, most tenants are well informed. They understand that the biggest way for them to attract, retain talent is going to be showing how forward-thinking they are as an organization. So some of these things which, the survey report has found do make a difference to attracting talent is something they will articulate and talk about.
Would you agree, Esme?
I think it depends where in the world you are and just your general approach to life, your general approach to workplace. I would say a lot of our Australian clients and partners don't need convincing, or perhaps as much convincing, or I shouldn't say convincing, perhaps influencing, or they're handheld as much. Slightly different workplace arena, shall we say, or workspace design point of view, I would say there. And I think just to pick up on Pragya's point, it depends where the client is in their journey, the scale of their organisation, as to how much kind of influence or the journey you need to take them on. I do think I almost said a buzzword there. The last few years have basically proven the value of workplace, where it was working and where it really wasn't working. And I think because of that, people understand that, hang on a minute, we need to do some employee listening. We need to understand where they see the value of coming into the office, what that office needs to provide for them. And I think all of this kind of speaks to that. So I think they're further along than they were. It just depends who the organisation is. Also, who you're talking to within the client organisation. If you're talking at a board level, that's completely different. If you're talking to the CFO, they're thinking about something. If you're talking to the COO, that's something different. And if you're talking to the FM rebranded kind of workspace experience team, that's also a different conversation. So that also really depends kind of what scale project you're talking about, I think.
And Dan, what has the response been to the report? Has it been kind of received enthusiastically or with scepticism? How do you feel it's been received?
I think it was interesting when we released it. Imagine this was June, and I said in my sort of intro piece a little bit that wasn't what was out there at the time in the media piece, which was very much the idea that home working was here to stay, and it would be something that was inherently positive going forwards, without really any discussion as to maybe what people wanted from their lives and from where they went to work. And there's a generational thing within that, but I think that idea, and it's felt to me that what we were talking about and what we were talking about engagement, about how people's attitude to where they work and why they work, has become ever closer to, I think, what we all understand is actually what we want from the places that we inhabit and we spend so much of our lives in. It shouldn't be a chore to come to work. We should really want to do it, and we should want to do it because the spaces we're in can be really transformational to how our moods are and how we actually feel. And I think that point that we were talking about that idea of why would you do it? I think the other thing for me, which I love about what we were talking about here and the research, is this idea that it's not necessarily about money. It's a little bit about attitude, about can you open yourself up to how your employees feel about it? How can you open yourself up to how to transform your organisation, not necessarily from the top down, but actually by engaging them, and how does that work? And if you do that, you'll get happier people, but also you'll be on this agenda, and it's so a bit less the CEO down and more about just an attitude to how we engage our people.
I'd like to touch on something that you mentioned, Esme, in your slides. You talked about the idea of regenerative design. We've been mainly talking about kind of being sustainable. I guess the idea of regenerative design is going one step further. It's like not trying to reduce harm, but it's actually having a positive impact. I think that's quite a long way off, to be honest. But what's your kind of concept of that, and how are you in your practice kind of working towards that? And what kind of time frame do you think we're looking at before we could see buildings that truly give back more than they take in terms of either carbon or potentially biodiversity or both?
So I spoke a little bit about this at the beginning. We have a practice group, I'm sure a lot of people do, who are focused solely on this. And like Ben mentioned, and you all know this probably far better than I do, if sustainability or sustainable design is about doing better, is about not doing any harm, then regenerative design is about doing better, giving back more, creating healthier spaces, better environments. And our Regen task force internally is our core way of doing that. And like I mentioned before, it is about upskilling. It's about ensuring we all reach the same level. We're all at a different stage in our journey. I'm on a completely different path, shall we say, or a different stage in my journey than lots of people across the practice. So that's kind of the way we're beginning to action it. And then it's working with clients in different ways. So it's not just about, we talked a little bit about this earlier, materials and specifying. It's actually, okay, well, how can we work with this client and rethink the leasing models so that we don't have to just continue doing Cat B fit-outs that get ripped out? Okay, what are the digital asset libraries that we can create with the client so that none of that goes to waste? And whether it's furniture, it's joinery pieces that can actually be taken out, moved to another site across the country. It's that kind of pushing the boundaries of our relationship with clients, I think, is the best example I can kind of really give as to how we're actioning it, and what our focuses are. And look, it is aspirational. We're achieving it. It depends what scale of a project as well. Are we building a building? Are we working on an adaptive reuse project? Is it an interiors project? It kind of depends on the scale, but yeah, does that answer a little bit?
Yeah, it definitely does. Yeah, Dan, what's Foster and Partners' approach to regenerative design? Do you have a kind of sense of it? Is it something you're looking at? Is it something that you hope to do in future? Where do you stand on it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the thing for us is obviously we have some very interesting clients and they push us very far along these lines. I think I'll cover two things. I think where I'm absolutely with Esme is this sort of, and I sort of covered it a little bit in that fit out that we were looking at in the video, was this sort of idea of the timeless fit out. Think about what you have and care about it as though it's a family heirloom rather than it's just something that's temporary, that I'll take that ceiling and I'll throw it away. We need to get ourselves into that mindset where we actually think about things for a much longer term and design them so they will change over time. So can the building be designed for multiple lifespans rather than a single lifespan? Can the stuff be, as you say, can the stuff within the building have multiple lifespans? Can it be used effectively in a way that allows it to change over time? And I think then the more technical side of regeneration is really interesting, and it relates to cities and pieces that are outside cities. It's ultimately something that is much more straightforward if you're in a nice piece of relatively flat landscape, and you can actually provide energy solutions which actually will make it fully regenerative. In an urban context, one has to take the embodied carbon into it. One has to take the overall sense of why you're building in a city like this. And I think we should be building in cities like this because of our attitude towards infrastructure, because of our attitude towards life and what we actually want from ourselves as human beings. So I think that's a really interesting question for us about why do we build where? What does it mean for the overall picture of carbon and regeneration? What's possible? But why would you make these choices as clients?
Great. I'm going to...
Then can I just say, because you mentioned biodiversity, one of the most exciting things I have seen that's kind of industry-wide, actually no, governmental-led, is the biodiversity net gain regulations that are coming in January. I think it's January, whereby every new development, it is just new, I think, has to give back, I think it's about 10%, I think. But that's actually, okay, fine, some stringent regulations that are coming through, and actually it's thinking about actioning something quite specific, but that has a massive impact. So I think the biodiversity side of things, I think people like, should I say Landsec, are quite ahead of this, I would say, and some other landlords, developers, asset managers. But yeah, I think that's kind of one of the more exciting or interesting things that I have seen that's actually out there or coming.
I'm going to put a shout out for our client Brookfield here.
Sorry, Brookfield. I didn't know whether you were, so then...
Because at Principal we did this amazing piece with this biodiversity analysis of both what had been on the site. It was former railway land, so you had very specific diversity there that had to be protected, and we installed this amazing roof that effectively allowed that to be treasured within the design. And amazing piece at the time, discussed with Hackney. They were very supportive of that, but kind of made it of its place just in terms of how it would support what had been there before and also widen it.
Well, there you go. Ahead of the curve and not waiting for kind of regulations to come in.
Thanks, Dan, for the shout out. I think we all know that the city is quite densely built as it stands. So getting anything more than a 0% biodiversity net gain isn't very hard. As you say, there's legislation delivery program, and as most of us have worked across longer term projects, by the time you've delivered a project, the design's still sort of catching up to new legislation. So there's a conversation around how we bridge that, and to your point earlier around how do we future-proof a project. I think those are the areas that we sort of need examining a little more.
And I guess that's an example maybe where legislation is having a positive impact. As you were saying before, maybe we can't wait for that. We need to do things ourselves, which leads
just maybe not enough, if Pragya's kind of saying that.
Yeah, which leads me on to my last question before I open it up to you guys. But what do you think are the kind of key challenges to overcome? What are the kind of roadblocks? What do we need to do to have more sustainable workplaces and therefore kind of happier workforces?
Some of the biggest roadblocks, how we communicate as an industry and communicate outside of our industry. I think we could get better at that. I think we could also perhaps know when to bring in experts. This is a huge topic. This touches no end of different parts of projects in our lives. And I think one thing we could definitely get better at, when perhaps not currently doing enough, is knowing when to invite the real experts to the table. We don't have to know everything. This kind of part of a project, although it tends to be quite holistic and oversee everything, doesn't tick every single box. So one of the roadblocks is, I guess, to an extent, knowing who to bring to the table and then getting them to the table. And then, yeah, my other point is around communication, misinformation perhaps a little bit as well, and getting a bit tighter on how we talk about things, the claims that we make, to kind of drive forward all of the change that we need to see.
Yeah, I think data is absolutely key. And to me, one of the things is just simply finding enough data. All the buildings that we have should be contributing to a wider set of understanding, both from post-occupancy reports about how they're operating, down to exactly why they're built, and why are we building them, how are we building them, what were they built out of. And if we can get that data set, and again, you probably realise I'm a bit techie in terms of where I like to talk about stuff, but that to me is the big thing. If we could allow ourselves to really find both the right data set for the purposes of the buildings we have, and also then make the way we manufacture it be data-based, I think that would be a massive step forward for us as an industry.
Pragya?
I think we've found our most successful projects have been where we've worked collaboratively and transparently. For any change to be implemented, I think it needs to be taken on board by all of its stakeholders. And that's not just as landlords, developers, tenants, individuals. Everyone has to be on board, vocal about what they want out of it. So I think that's quite important in overcoming blockades across most of the problems that come across to us.
Great. Okay, have we got any questions? I first saw this gentleman at the back there.
Data by its very nature is outdated. This is what we know, what happened yesterday and before that and all that. Few years from now, we might not need a parking space because people will be coming in driverless cars, get dropped off and go. So what I want to ask this panel is, what's the vision? As you said, that it takes 5, 10, 15 years to plan something. You can, to some extent, rely on the data. But then the pandemic hits you. And entire data that you have seen just falls off by the road. So how do you, because architecture is all about vision, not data. Steve Jobs said that I must give you something that you do not even know that you need. That's what architecture is all about.
Would you agree then?
I think certainly I'd agree in relationship to the ideas of designing for something that people don't know is key. I would argue that you need to base it on something. And when you're providing tools, we write lots of tools to kind of look at futures, ultimately. Look at differential futures for building. Let's just argue that can be possible, that you can design a tool and you can then look at it and decide, look at different ways of doing it, looking and potentially anticipating some of that. I would argue that the key thing is to find that model actually has some reality to it and it has a basis. So it depends. I would still say, for me, sustainability particularly is a data industry, really, and we need to, as architects, embrace that and make that the basis of what we do. For me, and I don't think we should see that as a stop to providing unbelievable solutions to people. I think they tend to come from the people that we work with as architects, and they tend to come from those organisations. Every project is different. It's fascinating. If you were to ask me, one of the fundamentals that I know from Foster's from all the years that I've worked for is like, okay, why do all the buildings look different? Because the clients are all completely different, and their needs and the sites are completely, everything that drives those buildings, and it ends up with rather different solutions, and I think solutions that are incredibly innovative. But that doesn't mean that they're not based upon something that is analytical as well.
This is why we perhaps should be worried about things like generative AI, but we should perhaps push back a little bit, because at the end of the day, you are always going to need that human layer, that layer that data can't overlay, to create those aspirational, inspirational places. And I also think that there's that side of things, but then there's also design is as much about the operational side, the day 2, 3, 4, 50 of the space that you're in. And for me, as kind of the strategist, I guess, and someone who also loves data, qualitative data perhaps a little bit more, it's about measurement And what you measure, you can also manage. So how can you understand that the space is actually working? That's where the data also comes in.
Great. We had another question.
Hello, my name's Helen Parton. I'm a workplace design journalist. I had a question for Esme. I'd like to hear some more from her about the learnings, perhaps, from BVN and their Australian market ostensibly. So we've heard a little bit about the biodiversity and a little about the flexible leasing, I think you mentioned. So what other learnings can the Australian market bring to the London market?
Big question, and I'm going to be very honest with you, we constantly debate this as a studio. It's something that, as somebody who's only ever really worked in this industry or in the built environment industry, it's something I heard an awful lot about. You go to Australia to get your inspiration for workplace. I've never really known why that is, but I've heard it on conference stages before. And it wasn't until I then worked for an Australian practice and I had something to compare my kind of experience with that I started to understand. I think there's something about the fully holistic approach to design, and I'm not saying that does not happen here, but perhaps how the market is built or created there or operates. I think the UK operates in a pretty siloed way. You tend to have a consultant for everything. I've been one of them, a consultant for everything that will do this part of a project and then pass it along, and this part of a project and then pass it along. Whereas I feel like it perhaps is a little bit more holistic, or that's certainly been my experience. So I'm not sure whether that's a learning. That's just something I've thought, that seems to be a bit different. And as somebody who has focused largely on strategy for strategy firms at the very front of a project and then passed it along and honestly not got that close to design, which has been a key frustration of mine career-wise, which is why I'm where I am. That's perhaps something. I also think, and I touched upon it a little bit earlier, when it comes to workplace projects, the client tends to be different. So this was shocking to me when I was uncovering some of our workplace projects that we've done the last 20, 30 years. The client is HR. And the CEO is always in the room. I'm like, oh my gosh. When I was doing a strategy piece of work, and it might be different in the world of design, although I'm not sure. You can get HR in the room and the CEO, but you might have to pay them or they come kicking or screaming. It's always, for that very reason, been extremely people-led. And I know that it's people-led here as well, and that's certainly what we all focus on. But I think the way that workplace is viewed and how it's looked after at an organisational level tends to be a little bit different, or that's certainly been my experience from both kind of sides. So I don't know, I guess the learning there, Helen, is what you were saying earlier, people-led spaces. And if you need to get to the nitty-gritty, you kind of got to have the people in the room, as opposed to having a project that's solely led by, let's say, property and perhaps FM. You've got to ensure you have the right people in the room. So not sure if that's a learning. Not sure if anyone's going to want to talk to me after this, but that's just two things I've kind of observed, let's say.
Great, thank you. We've got a gentleman at the back there.
With WeWork being wound up with receivership this week, our memories of lockdown, maybe everyone's got different memories, but that probably involved a sustainable home experience with lots of cups of tea in between dramatic contract encounters or whatever it was, but you did it at home with Biophilic or out the doors or whatever. And then I'd like to compare what you're feeling about workspace, the traditional workplace, our offices the last 50 years, the COVID experience, the lockdown experience, the WeWork experience and what they brought to the slides and the interactive whiteboards and buildings, et cetera, like that. And then also I'd like to add to that in my own personal workspace experience, which is the university studio, because a lot of our ideas about offices have come from getting new students, graduates, with the expectation of having fancy university-like facilities when they arrive at work. And I'd like to see how those four compare with each other and how you think they relate to the subject matter of sustainability. Thank you.
Probably try to break down your question in different aspects, but obviously these are my views. I think WeWork, forgetting receivership, the kind of spaces they offered was slightly different in the market at that point of time. And I think it was quick realization for a lot of people that there are different ways that you can work in. And Esme knows this more than me, but some organizations work still in offices. Some people work, fully collaboratively, open plan. Some people like to work from home. So I think WeWork was a good reckoner at that point of time for people to start recognizing that not all of us like to work in the same way. Some people want to be in a closed room. Some people want to have a buzz around them. My colleagues like to play music. It's differing for everyone. And I think that was a very good point for all of us to set up and take notice for. Lockdown, I had a baby the first month after lockdown, so a slightly different experience for me. But coming back to work, I think, and meeting people online on Zoom, it drives home the point that we had consultants who had paid off their mortgage, had an extra room in the house, and could work quite seamlessly. We had younger consultants who had clothes rails in the back, and they were in a rented apartment. So I think that drove home the point again around hybrid working, working from home, all of the other things we talk about, which is so good, and flexibility at work. It means different things to different people. They don't necessarily interpret it or accommodate it in the same way for a variety of different reasons. It depends on where they are in their different stage in life. I couldn't work from home having a toddler running around. There's no way. I just wanted to get back to the office. That was my position. And so I think the WeWork thing was, there's availability of different types of spaces to work from. I think the COVID piece was what's therefore relevant to you as an individual to work from. And I think going forward now, as you say, with students and universities, is coming home to that point around younger people sometimes do want that mentoring. They do want to have that buzz around them. It just depends on their day, their semester. They might be writing a dissertation and they want to be knee-deep in books, or they might be wanting to go for a night out over the weekend. So it's just recognizing we're all individuals. There's lots of conversations also around introverts, extroverts, people calling them out, mental health, well-being. There's a lot of things that all of us come across every day now, regularly in articles, in news magazines. So I think to me, it's bringing all of that and recognizing that together. We shouldn't be designing spaces just for one type of individual. It's, again, providing that flexibility for our colleagues to choose where they want to work and what works and produces the best out of them.
This is a topic we could talk about probably for hours, but we run out of time. So please join me in thanking our panelists, Pragya, Dan, and Esme. Thank you to Brookfield for hosting us. Thank you for coming.